The tinny jingle of the bell was swallowed by the sound of the rain. Daniel Brooks stood in the doorway of the coffee shop, rainwater dripping from the brim of his baseball cap onto the shoulders of his frayed canvas jacket. 11 o'clock at night. The place was empty save for the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the smell of damp steam. He scanned the room for table number 7, and then he saw her. She wasn't waiting for a date. She was sitting there like a survivor. The woman was huddled in the farthest corner, her hands clamped around a white porcelain mug, so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't crying out loud, but her thin shoulders trembled with every ragged, shallow breath. On the table lay a pile of shredded, tear-soaked napkins. Daniel froze. His first instinct was to turn around and leave. He was exhausted after a 10-hour shift and didn't have the strength to take on a stranger's troubles. But his feet wouldn't move. He recognized that tremor. It was the same way his mother had sat in the kitchen 30 years ago after receiving a foreclosure notice from the bank. Taking a deep breath, Daniel wiped the rain from his sleeve and walked slowly toward table number 7. He pulled out a chair. The sound of its legs scraping against the wooden floor made the woman jump. She looked up startled. Daniel was taken aback. Her face was pale, her makeup streaked, revealing deep, dark circles under her eyes. Those eyes weren't just sad. They were panicked. She stared at him like an intruder, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel didn't sit down right away. He stood there keeping a safe distance, his voice low and slow. "I'm Daniel. If you need to be alone, I can go." The woman Emma stared at him. She opened her mouth, but her trembling lips formed no words. Then her hands fell away from the mug and her shoulders slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. "Don't!" Her voice cracked hoarse. "Please, don't leave me alone." It wasn't an invitation. It was a plea. Daniel nodded and pulled the chair out to sit across from her. He didn't order a drink or offer a polite smile. He just placed his rough, calloused hands on the wooden table and remained silent. No one spoke for a full 5 minutes. There was only the sound of the rain drumming against the glass and the gradual calming of Emma's labored breathing. The quiet, steady presence of the stranger seemed to create an invisible barrier, keeping her from shattering completely. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, shredding another napkin. "I'm sorry you have to see me like this." "It's okay," Daniel replied simply, his gaze fixed on a scratch on the table. "I've seen worse people in better places." A short, bitter laugh escaped her. She looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The old flannel shirt, the faint smell of machine oil, and the tired but non-judgmental eyes. "You don't seem like the type for late-night online dating," she said. A faint smile touched Daniel's lips, revealing crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. "I don't know how to use those apps. My daughter, she's 7. She said I needed to meet someone, anyone, as long as it wasn't the lathe at the shop." "Your daughter has a lot of faith in you," Emma said, her gaze distant. "She thinks I can fix anything." Daniel looked down at his own hands, his thumb unconsciously rubbing at the black grease ingrained in his cuticles. "She doesn't know some things are just broken for good." His words hung in the air like a needle prick. Emma flinched. She stared at the grease on his hands. Tomorrow, her signature would be the reason hands just like his would no longer have work to do. His unintentional remark made Emma freeze. She stared intently at his oil-stained hands. Her expression flickered violently. She didn't know who he was, but his profession, his honest working-class appearance. He represented the very people whose livelihoods her signature would erase tomorrow. "What do you do?" she asked, her voice suddenly tense. "Night shift maintenance. I keep the machines from dying." He shrugged. "Machines are simple. I treat them well, they run. I neglect them, they stop. They can't lie." Emma bit her lower lip so hard she drew blood. She turned her face away, staring out at the black, rain-slicked window. "I wish people were that simple," she whispered. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and quickly answered. "Hey, Lucy." His tone shifted instantly soft, warm. On the other end, a little girl's voice chirped through the quiet cafe. "Dad, I left pizza in the microwave for you, don't eat it cold. And is she pretty?" Daniel glanced at Emma, the woman with the swollen eyes and haunted face. "She's..." Daniel hesitated for a second, then said with conviction, "She looks tired, sweetheart, but she's very strong." Emma froze. She turned back to him, fresh tears welling up. but this time she didn't wipe them away. "Go to sleep now. I'll be home soon." Daniel put his phone away. He saw Emma looking at him, her gaze boring into his soul, a look full of anguish and gratitude. He stood up. He knew there was nothing more he could do for her. His presence had served its purpose. "Go home," Daniel said softly. "It's cold out in the rain." Emma stood up as well. She looked at him, then blurted out a strange sentence. "You're a good man, Daniel. I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" he asked, surprised. "Because this world isn't fair to people like you." She turned and rushed out the door, her small frame swallowed by a large gray blazer disappearing into the rain as if fleeing a scene. Daniel stood alone by the empty table. He looked at the cup of tea she had left behind, untouched cold. He shook his head, pulled his collar up, and stepped out into the night. The next morning, 9:15. The rhythmic slam of the metal press was the factory's heartbeat. Daniel stood before machine number 4, his hand tightening around a wrench. He had worked here for 6 years, long enough to understand the language of the machines better than he understood people. But this morning, the whispers of the other mechanics made him more uneasy than the clang of metal. "The list is finalized," Mike from his crew whispered in his ear. "Heard they're making cuts." Daniel didn't answer, just swallowed dryly. He looked down at the worn-out toes of his safety boots. He didn't feel anger, only the image of Lucy's inhaler. It was only a third full. Losing his job meant losing his health insurance. Without that card, her prescription next week would cost more than this month's rent. The sharp click of high heels on the concrete floor echoed through the space, cutting through his thoughts. The entire assembly line slowed, then fell silent. A group of people in black suits approached. In the middle of them was the woman from last night. Daniel looked up. His heart skipped a beat. It was her, but she was no longer the woman huddled in the coffee shop. She wore a tailored gray suit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face a mask of composure. She walked past the hulking machines, her eyes never lingering on any single person, as if she were afraid that looking too closely would break her resolve. The group stopped directly in front of Daniel. "Ms. Whitmore, this is technical crew number 4, the manager announced. Daniel stood up straight, his hand holding the wrench trembling slightly before he tightened his grip to hide his confusion. He suddenly felt the grease on his work shirt was shamefully dirty next to her immaculate attire. Emma turned, her eyes met his. In that instant, time seemed to slow down. She recognized him. Her gaze flickered, sliding from his sun-weathered face down to his rough, oil-stained hands. Daniel held his breath. He wasn't pleading for himself. He looked at her, then at his brothers in arms standing silently beside him. "Please," he thought, "don't tell me you're the one here to wipe us all out." A muscle moved in Emma's throat. Her cold mask cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing a suppressed anguish. But she took a deep breath, turned her head away, and stared straight ahead. "Continue with your work," her voice rang out, quiet but clear. "Don't let the line stop." She walked away. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Her ignoring him was both a dismissal and a temporary reprieve. Lunch break. Daniel sat on the quietest step of the parking garage. He opened the lunchbox Lucy had packed for him. A neatly trimmed ham sandwich and a few apple slices that were starting to brown. A small note she had stuck to the lid fluttered in the breeze. "Eat up, Dad." He picked up the sandwich, but his clumsy hands dropped a few apple slices onto the dusty concrete. Daniel froze. He didn't walk away. He bent down, picked up each slice, carefully brushed off the dust, and wrapped them in a napkin. He wasn't sad about the food. He was sad about his daughter's effort. In these uncertain times, her innocent care was the only thing keeping him afloat. The PA system crackled to life. Announcement: all personnel report to the main hall at 1 p.m. Daniel put the lunchbox in his bag. He smoothed his shirt, took a long breath, and started walking. 1 p.m. The main hall? The air was thick with silence. Hundreds of people stood packed together, but no one spoke. The smell of sweat mingled with an invisible cloud of anxiety. The door opened. Emma stepped onto the stage. She placed a file on the lectern gently. "I'm not going to offer you empty platitudes." Her voice was calm, but laced with sorrow. "The corporation is facing significant hardship. To save the core of this company, I have been forced to make a painful decision. We will be shutting down the entire old production line." A ripple went through the room, a collective groan of despair, more painful than any shout of anger. Daniel leaned against the wall. He had expected it, but hearing her say the words still felt like a punch to the gut. "This means," Emma continued, her voice trembling slightly, "that all employees on this list will be terminated." She began to read the names. Each one fell into the silent void. Each name was a family's dinner table. When her finger slid down to the line, "Maintenance Technician," she paused. She looked up, searching the crowd, and found Daniel standing in the corner of the room. Their eyes met. Daniel didn't look at her with resentment. He looked at her with the profound sorrow of a father who had just lost the ability to protect his child. His gaze was so raw, so full of pain, it almost made Emma lose her footing. She knew he was a good man, and she knew what she was doing to him. Emma looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel Brooks," the name echoed. Daniel closed his eyes, resting his head lightly against the wall. The world around him seemed to blur. He didn't hear the names that followed. All he could see was Lucy's smile at home, a smile that was about to be warped by the worries of adults. 11:45 p.m. The rumbling compressor of the old refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence of the cramped apartment. Daniel sat on a wooden chair, his back stiff. In front of him, a white envelope lay on the table. He had opened it and read it for the 10th time. Notice of employment termination, department night shift. The letters were bold, sharp, and emotionless. He folded the paper, creased it sharply, then unfolded it again, as if doing it enough times would change the words inside, but they remained the same. Next to the letter was Lucy's lunchbox. Daniel opened the lid. The apple slices had turned brown. The sandwich was hard. He picked it up and took a bite. The dry bread caught in his throat, but he forced himself to swallow. He couldn't waste food, especially not now. Outside, the first raindrops began to patter on the tin roof. Buzz, buzz. The phone on the table vibrated again. The same name, Emma Whitmore. Daniel stared at the bright screen in the darkness. He had let it ring 3 times already. The anger from the afternoon had cooled, leaving only emptiness. He reached out his thumb, stained with a faint trace of grease, pressing the answer button. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse. The other end was silent for a moment, just the sound of a soft breath. "I know I shouldn't be calling this late." Emma's voice came through small and trembling, a stark contrast to her firm tone in the meeting hall. "But you called anyway." Daniel replied, his eyes on the streaks of rain running down the window pane. Silence hung between them, filled only by the sound of the rain growing heavier. "I'm not calling for your forgiveness," Emma continued, her voice struggling to stay calm. "I just wanted you to know, last night when I saw you at the shop, I hadn't signed the order, but this morning, I had to." Daniel didn't respond. He leaned his head back against the chair, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Her explanation didn't give him his job back, but it confirmed one thing: her vulnerability last night had been real. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. Emma's voice choked slightly. "I tried to think of the hundreds of names on that list, but in the end all I could see was your face in the coffee shop. I don't know why." A sad, humorless smile touched Daniel's lips. "Maybe because I was the only one there who didn't ask you who you were." On the other end of the line, Emma was silent for a long time. Then he heard a soft, short laugh, a mix of exhaustion and bitterness. "You're right," she replied, "and I don't know whether to thank you for that or feel worse." "Let's call it even," Daniel said. He heard his own sigh mingle with the refrigerator's hum. The call seemed like it would end there, but Emma quickly added her words faster, as if afraid he would hang up. "Tomorrow, I'll be at the factory to oversee the handover. If you could, please come. I owe you a direct conversation, not one through a microphone." Daniel looked at the wall clock. The second hand ticked rhythmically. Go there for what? To pack up his old tools and watch her victory lap. But then he remembered her eyes from the meeting. The panic when she saw him. She didn't look like a winner. "I'm not sure there's anything else I want to hear," Daniel said slowly, "but I'll come get my things." "I hope you do," Emma replied softly. The call ended. The screen went dark. Daniel turned off the kitchen light and sat in the darkness for a while longer. He looked out the window, where the yellow streetlight smeared across the rain-soaked glass. From the bedroom, Lucy's sleepy voice drifted out. "Dad." Are you going to work tomorrow? Daniel flinched. He looked toward the slightly ajar door. She was just talking in her sleep. I don't know either, sweetheart, he whispered into the empty air. The next morning. 8 o'clock. The sky was a heavy industrial gray, spitting a fine mist that grew thicker by the minute. Daniel walked through the security gate, his head bowed against the drizzle. The old security guard at the gate saw him and gave a slight sympathetic nod. He didn't ask for Daniel's ID badge anymore. Everyone at the factory knew why he was here. Daniel went straight to the workshop. He placed an empty cardboard box on his old workbench. Everything was just as he had left it yesterday, a half-empty water bottle, a few stray screws. The only difference was that someone else was now at his station. A young technician wearing a brand-new uniform was fumbling with the sensor control panel. He frowned, his finger hovering uncertainly over the bright red start button. Daniel watched from a distance. He wanted to walk over to tell the kid that machine number 4 needed its pressure valve primed gently before starting, or it would choke on oil. But he stopped himself. It wasn't his job anymore. He turned away, tossing a roll of tape and a few notebooks into his box. The smooth hum of a car engine sounded from the back lot. A silver sedan pulled up near a side entrance. The car door opened. Emma got out. Today she wasn't wearing the gray power suit. She had on a simple white blouse, sleeves rolled up, and her hair tied back loosely. She held a large black umbrella. She saw Daniel standing at the warehouse door holding his box. They looked at each other through the light rain. The distance between them wasn't far, but it felt like there was an invisible wall separating them. Emma took a few steps forward, her voice soft but clear over the whistling wind. You're early. Just wanted to get my things and be done with it, Daniel replied, his hand tightening on the edge of the cardboard box. Me too, Emma said, her gaze heavy as she looked toward the administration building. I need to look again at the place where I made a decision too quickly. Daniel didn't reply. He was about to walk toward his truck, but the sky suddenly opened up. A heavy downpour hammered the concrete, splashing up onto his pant legs. Instinctively, they both stepped back, taking shelter under the short metal awning of the warehouse. The space suddenly felt much smaller. The rain pounded violently on the tin roof, drowning out the sound of the machinery inside. They stood close, one of Daniel's shoulders already soaked. Emma folded her umbrella, and a stream of water ran from it, pooling at their feet. Are you angry with me? Emma asked, her eyes fixed on the white sheet of rain. Daniel was silent for a moment. He looked at his mud-splattered boots next to her clean leather shoes. I don't know, he said honestly. I'm just disappointed. Disappointed in what? That you didn't give anyone a chance to speak before you signed their name away. Emma let out a soft, self-mocking laugh. I was afraid, she confessed, her voice weak. I was afraid that if I sat and listened to all of you talk about your families, your children, I wouldn't have the courage to sign. And if I didn't sign, this entire corporation would go under. Daniel turned to look at her. Her face was pale, free of makeup, revealing the exhaustion of someone who also hadn't slept. Maybe, he said, his tone even, sometimes being a coward is a way to survive. Emma whipped her head around to look at him, surprised by his non-judgmental response. Then they both laughed, a short, light sound that dissolved into the rain. The downpour began to ease, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the edge of the awning. Emma pointed toward the workshop, where the faint blue neon lights had just flickered on. They're replacing your position with a semi-automated sensor system. They say it's more accurate than a person. I installed that machine by hand for the first time 10 years ago. Daniel said, his gaze distant as he looked into the workshop. I know exactly where it will break and why. A sensor can't hear the rhythm of the machine's vibrations. A strange light flickered in Emma's eyes. She looked at him intently. If I asked, would you show me where it breaks? Daniel looked at her. He saw the seriousness in her eyes, not the command of a boss, but the plea of someone who wanted to fix a mistake. If you really want to fix it, he answered slowly, I'll show you. Emma was silent for a long moment. She inhaled the damp, earthy smell of the rain, then said, Tomorrow I have to present a new plan to the board. I want to save a part of the old production line, but I need someone to prove it's still viable. Daniel didn't answer right away. He set his box down and rummaged through the clutter inside. He pulled out a small wrench, its handle worn, smooth, permanently marked by years of grease and toil. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her. Emma hesitantly took it. The wrench was cold and heavy in her hand. "That machine only breaks if someone forgets to tighten the safety bolt underneath," Daniel said. "A sensor can't scan that. Only a human hand can turn it." She clutched the wrench, looking up at him with a hint of astonishment. "You trust me to do the right thing." Daniel hoisted the box back onto his shoulder and adjusted his collar. "I don't trust bosses," he said, stepping out from under the awning as the rain stopped completely. "I only trust people who ask themselves why they made a mistake." He walked straight toward the gate, his solitary figure reflected on the wet pavement. Emma stood alone under the awning. She looked at the old wrench in her hand, then at his retreating back. For the first time in days, she felt like she was holding something solid, not just lifeless pieces of paper. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Offer. Late afternoon. The scraping sound of a screwdriver against the metal cage of an old fan echoed through the cramped apartment. Daniel was trying to fix the jammed rotor. His hands were covered in black grease, the cheap kind he'd bought from the discount hardware store, not the high-grade industrial lubricant from the factory. Beside the scattered screws, the screen of his old laptop flickered to life. A new email had arrived. Daniel glanced at it. He froze the screwdriver, slipping slightly in his hand. Subject: Old production line restoration project. Technical consultant needed. Sender: Emma Whitmore. Daniel held his breath for a beat. He stared at the preview text below. "I hope you'll consider this, not for the company, but for the machine." He relaxed his grip, and the screwdriver clattered onto the table. Outside, the afternoon sun had faded, casting long, weak stripes of light across the wooden floor. The bedroom door creaked open. Lucy walked out holding a glass of milk, her hair messy from a nap. She peered at the computer screen, her voice sleepy. "What are you reading, Dad?" "Just work stuff," Daniel replied quickly, closing the laptop as if hiding a secret. Lucy squinted and smiled. "Is it the lady in the white shirt again?" Daniel paused. He turned to his daughter, surprised by her childish intuition. Lucy set her milk on the table, her voice clear. "I remember. You said she was really sad. Sad people write long letters to find someone who will listen." Daniel smiled faintly, a rare, relaxed smile. He stroked her hair. "Yeah, maybe so. Drink your milk then? Do your homework?" Night fell. The apartment was silent. Lucy had fallen asleep on the sofa, clutching her worn-out teddy bear. Daniel sat back down at the table. The only sound was the steady tick-tock of the wall clock echoing in the empty space. He opened the email again. The cursor blinked on the reply button. Daniel clasped his hands together. The pride of a laid-off man told him to delete it. But the image of the old wrench he'd handed her in the rain came back to him. She had taken it. She genuinely wanted to fix things. He typed out a polite refusal, then deleted it. Finally, he wrote just 2 words. "I'll listen." Send. He shut down the computer. Darkness filled the room, but this time it didn't feel as heavy and suffocating as the night before. The next morning, 9 o'clock. Daniel walked into the lobby of the Whitmore corporate building. He wore his cleanest plaid shirt, but still felt out of place among the polished suits passing by. He wore a red plastic visitor's badge on his chest. A security guard gave him a polite but distant nod. The second-floor meeting room was small and private. On the wooden table were 2 steaming cups of coffee. Emma was waiting by the window. She turned as the door opened. Today she wasn't wearing a powerful gray suit. She had on a simple white blouse and dark trousers, her sleeves rolled up, looking more approachable and less intimidating. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone direct. "I didn't invite you here out of pity. That's not my style." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down without replying. He didn't need pity. He needed respect. Emma pushed a thick file across the table toward him. "This is the restoration project for line number 4. I want to save it, but I need someone who understands it from the inside out." Daniel glanced at the file cover, a slight smirk on his lips. "You have a whole team of engineers with fancy degrees. They know the formulas," Emma replied immediately, her gaze firm and direct. "You know its heartbeat." The door burst open with a bang. A middle-aged man stormed in, his face red with anger. It was Harris, the head of engineering. He shot Daniel a contemptuous look, then turned to Emma. "Ms. Whitmore Security told me he was back. He is no longer an employee of this company. Correct. Emma answered calmly, unfazed. This is an independent consulting contract. You're breaking protocol. Harris slammed his hand on the table. We don't rehire a terminated employee to give orders to current ones. Emma stood up straight. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to cut through Harris's anger. Because that protocol got rid of my best man. If you can fix the machine, Mr. Harris, then by all means do it. If not, then be quiet and let him speak. Harris was stunned into silence. He glared at Daniel with a mixture of challenge and disbelief, then sullenly stepped back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed as if to watch a show. The tension in the room was thick. The only sound was the whirring of a printer in the hallway. Daniel ignored Harris. He calmly unfolded the worn-out technical diagram. His callous, scratched finger traced a line across the blueprint. He stopped at a cluster of details around a pressure valve. Here. He pointed his voice low and steady. Oil valve number 3. It jams not because of a faulty sensor, but because the installer forgets to release the residual pressure before locking the pin. Harris frowned, about to object. Daniel continued without looking up. The sensor reports a thermal error, but it's actually a mechanical failure. All it needs is a new heat-resistant rubber gasket. Emma followed his finger, her expression shifting from worried to intensely focused. Can you prove it? She asked. Daniel looked up and folded the diagram. Give me half a day and a basic toolkit. Emma gave a slight nod. You've got them. The meeting ended quickly. Emma extended her hand. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel looked at her hand. He hesitated for a second, then, instead of shaking it, simply nodded. I'll take a look. No promises. That's enough, she smiled. He stood up, took his visitor's badge, and left. As the door closed, Harris asked quietly, his voice still laced with resentment. You're trusting that grease monkey? Emma looked at Daniel's untouched coffee still steaming and replied softly, No, but I trust what he just pointed out. That evening, Daniel spread a copy of the technical diagram on the dining table. Lucy sat beside him, a box of crayons in hand, scribbling on a white piece of paper. What are you drawing? Daniel asked, his eyes still fixed on the valve diagram, a pencil in his hand as he recalculated pressures. Your machine, Lucy answered, taking a red crayon and drawing a bold line across her picture. I'm coloring the broken part so you'll know where to fix it tomorrow. Daniel looked at his daughter's drawing. He was startled. Lucy's red crayon had drawn a line directly across the valve joint, the exact spot he had argued with Harris about that morning. It was an uncanny coincidence. How did you know it was broken there? He asked, his voice a little shaky. Lucy shrugged, blowing away some crayon dust. I just saw it turn red in my head. That spot hurts. You have to fix it so it stops hurting Dad. Daniel looked at his daughter, then out the window. The streetlights reflected on his laptop screen, which was still open to Emma's email, confirming the schedule. On-site inspection begins at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. He felt a jolt run down his spine. Maybe his going back there wasn't just about fixing a machine. Some things were connected in ways that engineering couldn't explain. Early the next morning, the factory gate opened 30 minutes earlier than usual. Daniel walked in a worn leather tool bag slung over his shoulder. He wore his old faded blue coveralls and steel-toed boots caked with road dust. Inside the workshop, a few day-shift technicians looked at him. Their gazes were curious, mixed with a little caution. To them, Daniel was the guy who got crossed off the list, trying to make a comeback. Daniel paid them no mind. He walked straight to assembly line number 4. Emma was already there. She stood by the control panel, holding 2 paper coffee cups, the diagram spread out on the table. You're right on time, she said, handing him a cup. You're early, Daniel replied, taking the cup, its warmth spreading through his calloused hands. The air between them was still a bit awkward, but not hostile. It felt like 2 strangers forced onto the same boat, trying to figure out how the other one rose. Daniel set his cup down and opened the control panel cover. He flipped a secondary breaker. The generator hummed for a moment, then went silent. Hold this for me, Daniel said, handing Emma the pressure gauge. Emma took it clumsily. As she tried to read the dial, her elbow brushed against an open oil line. A black streak of oil splattered onto the sleeve of her crisp white shirt. Emma flinched. Oh, damn! Daniel calmly pulled a rag from his back pocket and handed it to her. "It's all right. Every rookie gets their hands dirty." Emma took the grimy rag and dabbed at the stain on her expensive shirt. She laughed a self-deprecating sound. "I used to think I knew how to run this whole factory. Now I realize I'm only good at reading reports in an office." Daniel, tightening a bolt, called back, "Machines can't read reports." Just then the large workshop door swung open. A bright, childish voice cut through the heavy metallic atmosphere. "Dad!" Daniel spun around. Lucy was standing in the doorway with the old security guard clutching a lunchbox. "I brought you lunch, and for the lady too." Daniel quickly wiped his hands and walked over. Emma followed. She bent down to take the lunchbox from the little girl, surprised. "Thank you. Do you know who I am?" Lucy beamed and pointed at her. "The lady in the white shirt Dad said you have a nice smile." Daniel froze, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Emma looked up at him, and they both started laughing. Their laughter echoed among the clanging metal, easing the tension. Lucy couldn't sit still. She climbed onto a stool, picked up a tiny wrench from the floor, and pretended to tighten invisible bolts. "I'm helping Dad. This part's broken." Lucy's giggles were like a balm for the suffocating space. Daniel returned to his work, his spirits lighter. He inspected the oil lines, his fingers feeling each joint, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He stopped at pressure valve number 3. "Cut the secondary power," he ordered quickly. Emma complied instantly, flipping the switch decisively. No questions asked. Daniel leaned in close, shining a flashlight into the narrow gap. Just as he suspected, and just as Lucy's red crayon had indicated a tiny hairline crack hidden behind the rubber gasket. "Found it," he whispered. He removed the pin, replaced the worn-out gasket with a new one, and wiped away the leaked oil. His movements were precise, as clean as a surgeon's. Emma watched from the side, asking softly, "How did you know it was exactly there?" Daniel tightened the last bolt, stood up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Last night my daughter drew a picture of the machine. She colored this exact spot red. Kids see things that we adults miss because we're too busy worrying." Emma looked over at Lucy, who was now playing with some screws, and her expression softened. "Maybe she's right." "Let's try it again," Daniel said. He pressed the green start button. The engine whirred to life. Whir, whir. The large gears began to turn slowly, then faster, settling into a steady, rhythmic thumping. The indicator light on the control panel switched from red to a brilliant solid green. Lucy cheered, jumping up and down. "It's working, Dad. The machine is working." Emma stared at that green light and let out a long, slow breath. Her shoulders relaxed. It wasn't just that the line was running again. It was that something inside her, a belief in people and the possibility of repair, had just started moving again, too. Daniel packed his tools into his bag. Lucy ran to take his hand, then turned to Emma with a proud voice. "My dad's the best you know." Emma knelt down to the girl's eye level, smiling genuinely. A smile free of any CEO's calculations. "I know. Thank you for the lunch, and thank you for showing us where it was broken." The three of them stood there in the morning sun, streaming through the workshop window, accompanied by the steady hum of the machine. A rare moment of peace. As Daniel was about to leave with Lucy, Emma called out, "Daniel." He stopped and turned back. "Tomorrow the board of directors is coming for a direct inspection." Her voice was serious again. "I need you to be there." Daniel hesitated. He looked at his old work clothes, then at the newly repaired machine. "I'm just a temporary consultant," he replied. "No." Emma took a step forward, her gaze resolute. "Tomorrow you're the only one who knows how to prove its value. If you're not there, they'll shut it down for good." Daniel looked at her, not answering right away. He looked down at Lucy. She was holding the small wrench he'd given her eyes full of hope. He gave a slight nod, then turned and walked out. Outside the window, the figures of the father and daughter faded into the distance. Inside the workshop, the machine kept running a signal of the real battle to come tomorrow, the first morning of February. A chill radiated from the massive metal structures, seeping into the work coats of the mechanics huddled around line number 4. They were the ones who were left, or the ones who had been temporarily called back. The atmosphere felt less like a workday, and more like a trial. Frank, a mechanic in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, spat a piece of chewing gum onto the floor. He scowled at Daniel, who was double-checking a circuit board. "What the hell are we doing here? Polishing a piece of junk that's about to be sent to the scrapyard, while the boss sits in her air-conditioned office drinking coffee." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. The discontent of laborers always flared up when their futures felt uncertain. Daniel stood up, brushing dust from his knees. He looked at Frank and replied calmly, "Frank, listen, I'm not doing this for her or for this damn company. I'm doing it because this machine didn't do anything wrong. I don't want to see something I've taken care of for 10 years turn into a pile of scrap. It's that simple." "Easy for you to say," Frank sneered. "But she's the one who signs the orders." The workshop door swung open. Emma walked in. She wasn't with her usual entourage, no security, no briefcase. She was just holding a paper coffee cup, wearing a simple long coat. She walked straight toward the disgruntled crowd. "If I'm wrong," her voice rang out clearly over the noise, "then let me be the one to watch it fail. But if I'm right, you'll all have your jobs back next week." The group of mechanics fell silent. All eyes were on her, scrutinizing. Daniel gave her a slight nod, then turned back to the control panel. "Let's begin," Emma ordered. Daniel hit the button. The engine shrieked. Screech. E. A small electric spark shot from a rotor joint with a pop, followed by the faint, acrid smell of burning oil. The line jerked twice and then stopped dead. "I told you!" Tom, a young engineer in the back, shouted, a triumphant look on his face. "It's junk. We're wasting our time." Frank stepped back, shaking his head in disgust. Disappointment was etched on the faces of the older mechanics. They had hoped even just a little, but reality was too harsh. Emma stood frozen, her hand clenching the coffee cup. Her face went pale. Daniel didn't panic. He knelt calmly, cut the power, and removed the safety shield. He knew this machine's illness. It was cold. It needed to be warmed up slowly, not forced to run. The tension was so thick you could hear Tom's heavy breathing. "It's okay," Daniel's voice came from under the machine, still even. "It's just not ready yet. Like someone who's been sick and has to learn how to breathe again." Lucy, who had been playing quietly in a corner on a wooden crate, her school was closed due to a snowstorm, suddenly stood up. She ran over, looked at the massive silent machine and said loudly, "Dad, this machine is like when I learned to ride my bike. You have to fall a few times and wobble a lot before you can go straight." The child's innocent words rang out, breaking the heavy mood of the frowning men. Frank looked at the little girl, then let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. "Kid's got a point. My pickup truck has to cough 3 times every morning before it'll start." The whole workshop broke into laughter. The sound spread light and genuine. The hostility melted away, replaced by the patience of fathers and uncles. Emma looked at Lucy, then at Daniel, who was busy under the machine. Their eyes met. For the first time, their relationship wasn't about work. It was about the shared empathy of two people trying to get their own lives running again. "All right." Daniel stood up, wiping a smear of grease from his cheek. "Let's try this again." He pressed the button. This time the engine purred softly, then settled into a steady, rhythmic thump. The conveyor belt began to move. Metal parts were stamped out in a smooth, shining rhythm. Everyone held their breath. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The machine ran flawlessly. "It's alive!" Frank muttered, clapping Daniel hard on the shoulder. "Maybe this really is worth a shot." Emma let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping in relief. She didn't smile in victory. She smiled in relief. Lucy tugged on Daniel's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, does that mean she won?" Daniel looked at Emma, standing among the workers, at the grateful look she gave him. He ruffled his daughter's hair and smiled. "No, we all won." That evening, Daniel was clearing the dinner table. On the old radio on top of the fridge, the local business report droned on. Whitmore Industries has officially resumed production on a key line after a 6-month halt. The company's stock saw a slight increase. Daniel reached over and turned it off. The room fell silent. He didn't need to hear people praise something when he knew the price was the sweat and struggle of so many. His phone buzzed with a single beep. A new text message. From Emma. The message was short. "I need to see you. It's not about the machines." Daniel looked at the screen, his thumb tapping lightly on the wooden table. He thought for a second, then texted back, "The usual place." The reply was immediate. "Yes, 8 o'clock." He put on his windbreaker, zipping it up to his chin. Outside, a light drizzle had started to fall again. The old coffee shop was quiet. The same smell of burnt coffee and the steady ticking of the wall clock, just like the first time they met. Emma was already there at the same table number 7 in the corner, but this time there was no laptop, no documents, and no shredded napkins. Just a cup of cold tea. Daniel walked over, nodded a greeting, and pulled out a chair. No one spoke for the first minute. There was only the sound of the rain outside and the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. This silence wasn't awkward like the first time. It was colored with the shared understanding of battle-weary comrades. Emma spoke first, her eyes still on her tea. Today, when the board of directors applauded, I felt nothing, just empty. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice low. That's just the adrenaline wearing off. Emma looked up at him. Her eyes were shadowed but clear. You lost your job. You lost any faith you had in me. And yet you stood there this morning defending that machine. How did you do it? Daniel looked out the window where the streetlights blurred in the rain. He answered slowly. There was no grand plan. I just did what needed to be done, one step at a time. I'm different, Emma said with a faint, tired smile. I work 12 hours a day because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I stop, I'll realize I have nothing besides my job title. Well, you've stopped now, Daniel said softly. And I'm still breathing, she whispered as if confirming it to herself. They both laughed, a small, short, but genuine laugh. Daniel laced his fingers together on the table. I survive because I have someone to worry about. When you have to make dinner for a kid, drive her to school, get her medicine, you don't have time to fall apart. Lucy keeps me grounded more than any business plan ever could. Emma watched him intently. Her gaze softened a mix of admiration and a hint of sadness. You're lucky, she said quietly. I thought someone like you would hate me forever. Daniel shook his head. I don't have time for hate. People only hate when they want to go back to the past. I just need to keep moving forward for my daughter. She was silent. Her hand reached into her jacket pocket and placed a small object on the table. It was a small, worn metal tag, a piece of an old nameplate from the factory that she had almost thrown away. I kept it, her voice trembled slightly, to remind myself of what I almost destroyed. Daniel looked at the tag, then at her. He smiled the gentle smile of a seasoned craftsman. You'd be better off drilling a hole in it and using it as a keychain. Carry it with you. It'll feel less heavy. The air between them settled as comfortable as the steady rain outside. Emma took a deep breath and asked the question she'd been holding on to for a long time. Daniel, if one day I have to leave all this, do you think it's possible to build something new? If it helps people stand on their own 2 feet, then yes, he answered immediately without hesitation. Would you stand with me? The question hung in the air. Daniel didn't answer right away. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the detailed hand-drawn schematic of line number 4 that he had stayed up all night to finish. He pushed it across the table to her. This is what I know how to do. The rest you'll have to figure out for yourself. Emma took the paper and unfolded it. Her eyes lit up as she looked at the meticulous pencil drawings. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket over her heart. Daniel got home after the rain had stopped. Lucy was sitting on the living room floor surrounded by cardboard and glue. Dad, she cheered when she saw him. I made a paper factory. I'm going to make it run forever so it never breaks again. Daniel bent down, stroked his daughter's hair, and looked at the crooked but colorful model. Yeah, if people take care of it with their own 2 hands, it probably won't. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights were on. Everything seemed peaceful, but peace is often the quiet before the storm. The next morning, an internal email with a blaring red subject line spread through the company's system. Urgent audit of all restructuring projects, suspected financial discrepancies. In her office, Emma received a summons. She quietly placed Daniel's drawing in a drawer and locked it. At home, Daniel was pouring coffee while scrolling through the news on his phone. His hand holding the mug froze. A short text from Emma appeared on his screen. If I don't make it back, don't let them turn off the machine. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. He set his coffee mug down on the table with a firm, solid thud. The story of the machine wasn't over. It was just shifting to a different kind of war. Mourning. The sky was gray, a fine mist casting a dreary pall over the city. Daniel stood by the window phone in hand. On the screen, the glaring red headline of the internal news bulletin hit him: Production Line Restoration Project under investigation for suspected financial misconduct. Just below it was the cold announcement: CEO Emma Whitmore suspended pending investigation. Daniel's phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from former colleagues flooded in. "Stay out of this, Dan. They're auditing the whole engineering team. Don't get caught in the crossfire." Daniel turned off the screen and put the phone in his pocket. He stared out at the rain. If she's guilty, I'll know, he thought. And if she's not, I can't just stand by. Noon. Daniel drove his old pickup to the factory gate. The main entrance was sealed with yellow caution tape. A security guard stopped him, shaking his head. Only personnel authorized by the audit committee are allowed in Daniel. Just then, the door to the office building opened. Emma walked out. She was carrying a small cardboard box of personal belongings. No one was there to see her off. She walked alone, a small figure in the vast, rain-soaked concrete lot. Daniel got out of his truck and walked toward the fence. Emma saw him. She stopped, her eyes weary but resolute. "You didn't have to come," she called out over the iron fence, her voice partially carried away by the wind. "This has nothing to do with you." "I know," Daniel called back, "but it has to do with the truth." Emma gave a sad smile and shook her head. "The truth won't save anyone here, Daniel. They only believe in numbers." She turned and walked quickly to her car, leaving Daniel with his hands gripping the cold iron bars. In his breast pocket, the technical drawing was a sharp, painful presence. Evening. The apartment was dark. Daniel sat at the dining table, a thick maintenance logbook and a stack of old supply invoices spread before him. Lucy came out of her room, hugging her teddy bear and rubbing her eyes. "Dad, is the lady in the white shirt in trouble?" Daniel looked up at her. He didn't want to lie to his child. "Yeah, people think she did something wrong, Lucy." "Did she, Dad?" Daniel looked at the numbers in his logbook. He knew where every single screw had been purchased and for how much. She hadn't taken a dime. "I don't think so," he said thoughtfully. "If she didn't do anything wrong," Lucy asked, her voice innocent but cutting to his core, "why isn't anyone speaking up for her?" His daughter's question made Daniel freeze. He remembered his colleagues' warnings. Stay out of it. Silence was the safest way to survive, but silence was also what killed trust. He closed the logbook with a snap. His expression hardened. He couldn't teach his daughter to live with integrity if he chose cowardice at a moment like this. The next morning, the Internal Investigations Office was in the cold, paper-scented basement of the corporate building. Daniel walked in and placed the thick stack of documents on the lead auditor's desk. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was solid and definitive. "What is this?" the auditor asked, pushing his glasses up. The complete technical logs cross-referenced invoices and before and after photos of line number 4, Daniel stated clearly. "I personally supervise the work. Every single cost matches up down to the last cent." The auditor flipped through a few pages, frowning at him. "You were terminated. Why are you doing this? Who are you trying to protect?" Daniel stood tall, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm not protecting anyone. I just don't want the hard work of decent people to be forgotten because of some political game." The secretary recorded his statement verbatim in the meeting minutes. Afternoon. The news spread like wildfire. The data provided by witness D. Brooks confirmed the entire restructuring process was transparent. The suspension order was lifted. The internal paper reported, "Project Restart vindicated. CEO Emma Whitmore reinstated." Daniel's phone rang. "They let me back in." Emma's voice came through thick with emotion, as if she were about to cry. "Thank you." Daniel was watching Lucy color, and a small smile touched his lips. "Don't thank me, thank Lucy. She asked me why no one was speaking up for you." Beside him, Lucy was busy coloring a picture of a factory with 3 people standing next to it. She took a bright yellow crayon and colored in the female figure's shirt. "Dad, I'm making her shirt yellow," Lucy said. "Yellow is the color of the sun coming back up." "Yeah," Daniel stroked her head. "That color suits her." Late evening. Daniel sat on the sofa, checking his email on his laptop. A new email from Emma had just arrived. I'm going back to the factory tomorrow, but I don't want to start in the office. I want to start where the first line came back to life. Daniel read it, a small smile of relief on his face. All right, he whispered. It's still waiting for you. He closed the laptop. On the screen just before it went dark was the last page of the public investigation report. At the very bottom, there was a small note in red, data provided by Daniel Brooks. Employment status, undetermined, file pending review. Daniel looked at the words without worry or regret. He had gambled his own security. The soft, clear light of March filtered through the massive steel frames of the factory. The air was no longer biting cold like it had been in early winter. Emma walked through the gate of workshop number 4. The yellow Project Restart suspended sign had been taken down, leaving only clean patches of new paint. She walked slowly down the aisle, her hand lightly touching the metal skin of the machines. The steel that had once been so cold was now warm from operation. The engineering manager followed behind her, eagerly reporting, "The machine's been running stable for 48 hours, ma'am. 98% efficiency. You don't need to worry anymore." Emma stopped and smiled faintly. "I'm not worried. I just want to listen to it breathe for a minute." She stood still, closing her eyes. The rhythmic thump, 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 thump of the press was deep and steady, like the heartbeat of someone brought back from the dead. A side door creaked open. Emma turned. Daniel walked in. He wasn't in uniform, just a simple olive green sweater, carrying a small, varnished wooden box. Trotting behind him was Lucy, a bright red backpack on her shoulders. "I thought you didn't like coming back to places where things ended," Emma said, her eyes lighting up with relief. Daniel walked over and placed the wooden box on a workbench next to the control panel. "This isn't an ending. This is what's left over." Lucy stood on her tiptoes, showing it off excitedly. "Dad made it for you. It's a box for the leftover screws. I drew a picture of you on the lid." Emma laughed. This time it was a real laugh, unrestrained and unreserved. She bent down to look at the box. Inside, lined with velvet, were old rusted screws, the ones that had been considered scrap that Daniel had polished and arranged neatly like precious relics. On the lid was Lucy's crayon drawing 3 stick figures, holding hands next to a gray square. Emma traced the drawing with her finger and asked softly, "Lucy, who are these 3 people?" Lucy answered immediately, her voice bright. "It's you, Dad, and the machine." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening. "The machine gets a spot, too." Lucy nodded firmly. "It can't talk, but it's how you and Dad became friends. My teacher says friends are supposed to stand next to each other." Daniel looked at his daughter, then up at Emma. Their eyes met in a quiet moment. The gap between boss and employee, between the one who fired and the one who was fired, was gone. There was only warm understanding. The 3 of them walked out to the steps behind the workshop, where the sun was now high in the sky. Emma took a deep breath of the fresh air, looking toward the distant smokestacks. "I used to think that when things broke, the only solution was to replace them with something new. Now I know some things don't need to be replaced. They just need someone patient enough to believe they're still worth saving." Daniel leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and nodded slightly. "You don't have to thank me." Emma turned to him, shook her head, and smiled. "I'm not thanking you. I'm remembering." A comfortable silence stretched between them, with only the sound of the wind and the steady hum of the machine in the background. Suddenly, Lucy ran to a corner of the yard where there was a large crack in the old concrete, a scar from its time of abandonment. She pulled a tiny bouquet of wildflowers from her backpack and carefully tucked them into the crack. Daniel called after her. "Lucy, what are you doing?" Lucy turned back, dusted off her hands, and beamed. "I'm planting something beautiful in the broken part. So next time we come, it will have flowers." Daniel and Emma both looked at the tiny, fragile yet resilient flower growing from the concrete crack. The machine kept running. The bright spring sun reflected off the metal frames, turning what was old into something that glittered. The 3 of them stood together, no one making any promises about the future, but they knew the storm had passed. Not everyone gets a second chance to start over. But if you still have someone to believe in and something to hold on to, it's never too late.